Last time we had a bit of a history lesson, delving into the Old Testament scriptures and looking at the roots of Christianity, which are in fact Jewish. Those writings also show us that Jesus came to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. By prophecy, I mean what is foretold in the scriptures. A large part of the Bible consists of prophecy, what God spoke to his people about the future through his prophets. Jesus was the promised Messiah, which means the anointed one. We often refer to Jesus as Christ. This word is the Greek form of Messiah. He was the one that the Jewish people were waiting for to come and rescue them from their enemies. But he did not come in the way most of them expected. That was why so many didn't recognize him or accept him. Rather than a victorious deliverer, he came as a suffering servant to lay down his life. In order to understand Jesus, we need to know something about his background and culture, which we find in the Old Testament. I encourage you to read and listen to teaching on this. Now let me just say a word about the Old Testament, as we usually call it. This is not an accurate description. The Bible is a collection of 66 books, and this part of the Bible is actually made up of history, the law given by God to Moses for the Jewish people, some poetry and prophetic writings. A more appropriate name would be the Scriptures or the Jewish writings. The reason it's come to be called the Old Testament is that during the time it was written, the people were living under the first or the Old Covenant that God had made with the people. He promised that there would be a new covenant which would be better. This came through the death and resurrection of Jesus. We'll look at covenants in more detail another time. They're a very important Bible principle. The four Gospels written by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John in what we call the New Testament tell us about Jesus' life, birth, death and resurrection. Each describes a different aspect of the same story. Jesus was born into a Jewish culture and lived with a biblical Jewish background. He was born into a Jewish family and he followed the Jewish law. So in order to get to know Jesus' background, we have to read the Jewish writings. For example, in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus is in the synagogue, which was like a Jewish church, he is asked to read from the scriptures. He reads from Isaiah 61 verse 1 and then applies it to himself. And he came to Nazareth where he'd been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus' teachings are full of Jewish biblical references, and it's impossible to fully understand them without knowing the background. In Matthew 5, 6 and 7, he continually refers back to what the Jewish law said, and he explains what the spirit of the law means. For example, in Matthew chapter 5, he says, "You have heard that it was said in the law, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Jesus was explaining that keeping the law was not just following a set of rules. What mattered was what was in your heart. He said he had come to fulfill or complete the law, not to do away with it. He expected his followers to live by God's law and understand God's plan. At this time, of course, he had not yet died or risen again. The New Testament or covenant did not actually come into force until Jesus died and rose again at the end of the Gospels. Besides the four Gospels, the New Testament is largely made up of the letters written by the Apostle Paul, himself a Jew and a teacher of the law. He explains the position of the Jewish people very clearly in his letter to the Roman Gentile Christians. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people, whom he foreknew. Most of the Israelites rejected Jesus, but Paul explains why in Romans 11. Did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Paul was God's messenger of salvation to the Gentiles, but he hopes to make his fellow Jews jealous when they see Gentiles putting their faith in Jesus. This was God's plan all along. Using the picture of an olive tree, Paul tells the Romans, "But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you." He is saying that Israel is the olive tree, the Jews are the natural branches, the Gentiles, ourselves, are wild branches grafted in, but supported by the root, which is Israel. Finally, Paul says, "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I want you to understand this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins." When you understand that Jewish hearts were purposely hardened by God so that the Gentiles could be saved, you will understand that we have a close relationship with the Jewish people. Our salvation depends on them, and we owe them an enormous debt. We'll talk more about this another time.